everyone, welcome to my kitchen. My name is Lisa Goad. I've been a member of RCPC for about 10 years, and I'm also the program coordinator and one of the co-founders of House of Bread. House of Bread is a nonprofit organization operating out of the Leap Kitchen over in the West End, just across the Memorial Bridge from the Grandin Village. We work with women who are coming out of incarceration. We teach them kitchen skills and baking skills and build good relationships in hopes of helping them get on a better path and get employed. So I want to invite you to join me today in some bread baking. In your Advent kit, you received a recipe for brioche bread. This recipe is a variation on one that we use at House of Bread, and it will make 2 loaves of brioche bread. So in my family, there's 5 of us, and we go through bread very quickly. If you don't have as many people or as many bread eaters, and you don't want to make 2 loaves, you can definitely cut this recipe in half. Just use half of all of the ingredients, and it will come out fine. You can also freeze a loaf. This bread, if you bake it and then freeze it, it'll freeze really well, and you can pull it out of your freezer to use another time, or give a loaf to a friend or a neighbor. So before we get started, there's some variations that we're going to talk about as we go through. You can make this bread in a loaf bread, like a sandwich bread, just in a regular loaf pan. You can shape it as an artisan loaf and bake it on a baking sheet. And there's also some options for putting like a sweet filling in it to make just kind of a tasty treat, or you can make it a plain loaf with just the bread. So we'll talk about that as we get a little bit further into it. So I invite you to follow along and bake your own bread at home. I have the advantage of having my kitchen set up like a cooking show, and I've already done a lot of the measuring. So if you're having trouble keeping up, feel free to just pause the video and catch up as you can, or you can watch the whole thing just to get an idea of what we're doing and then make it on your own. But either way, I hope you will have fun and enjoy the bread. So let's get started. I'm going to start by measuring out my dry ingredients. I have not done this part yet. When I measure flour, it's really hard to measure flour accurately, so I prefer to always work in weights and to weigh my flour. If you do not have a kitchen scale, that's completely fine. I put on the recipe the weight and also the equivalent volume, so you can measure it just in a measuring cup. I'm going to be doing it on my kitchen scale. If you are measuring with a measuring cup, it's really helpful to like spoon the flour into the measuring cup instead of scooping it out of the canister, so that it's nice and light and fluffy, and you're a lot less likely to get too much flour in it, which can make the bread kind of dry. So I just spoon it out like that. I'm going to go ahead and just weigh it out into my bowl. If you're making the full recipe, we're going for 30 ounces of flour. It does not have to be exact, because you'll see later we're going to need more flour into it after we get our dough risen for the first time. So no need to get it down to the 1/10 of an ounce or anything like that. Okay, let's go. And so to the flour, I'm going to add my yeast and salt. This recipe calls for instant yeast, which is a little bit different than the active dry yeast, and you can really use either one. If you're using instant yeast, you can just add it straight to the dry ingredients and stir it in, and when you add the wet ingredients, it starts doing its thing to make the bread rise. If you're using instant dry yeast, you might want to mix your yeast in with some of your wet ingredients and let it sit for a few minutes so it can start to bubble and wake up before you start mixing everything else together. So I'm just going to stir that so that it's mixed together when we get ready to add the dry ingredients. And then I'm going to set that aside. Now I'm going to move on to the wet ingredients. I've already got most of these measured out, so if you need to pause the video and do some measuring, that's totally fine. A lot of these ingredients I've said in the recipe to warm up or get to room temperature, and the reason for that is because we're going to ask this bread to rise. We're going to leave it to rise. And if your ingredients are starting out cold, it'll still work. It'll just take a lot longer for the bread to rise. So that's the reasoning for warming everything up. So I'm going to start with 2 sticks of butter that I have melted in the microwave. You could do it on a stovetop if that's easier for you. And a cup of milk that I've also warmed up. When you're warming these things up, you want it to feel warm to the touch, but you don't want it to be so hot that it would burn you, because then it might kill the yeast. You want it to just be warmer than room temperature, but not hot enough to be uncomfortable if you touched it. And I'm using skim milk because that's what I happen to have on hand, but you can use any kind of milk. It'll all work. You could even use half and half or cream if you want to make it extra rich. There's a lot of butter in it though, so you probably don't need cream unless that's all you have on hand. I'm going to add the honey with the spatula here. I've already cracked my eggs into this bowl, but I'm going to just use a fork to kind of break them up and whisk them all together before I add them to the other liquid ingredients. And here you want to make sure, like I said, you don't want your liquid ingredients to be so hot that they can kill the yeast, and you also don't want them to be so hot that they can cook the eggs. So be real careful that your stuff in your other liquid ingredients aren't too hot. Okay, with all the liquid ingredients in here, I'm just going to stir this together so it's nice and evenly mixed. And then we'll stir the flour mixture into the wet ingredients. I'm using the biggest mixing bowl I have, and I'm not sure it's going to be big enough once it rises. So definitely use the biggest bowl you can find. So once you've got all your flour stirred into the wet ingredients, you will notice that this looks nothing like bread dough. If you're used to making bread, this is much stickier. It's almost like a cake batter instead of a bread dough. I do that on purpose. It's especially important at House of Bread because wet doughs will rise faster than drier doughs. So I like to keep this first part wet, and we're going to let it rise for a little while, and then we will come back and knead in some more flour to get it to the consistency we need for the second rise. So I am going to set this aside. I'm going to toss a towel over it. You can cover it with plastic wrap if you don't have a towel handy. Just something to keep it from drying out on the top. And then I'm going to set this aside and let it rise. My oven has a proof setting, and so I like to set the bowl in my oven to keep it warm, but you definitely don't have to have that. You can just, if you're doing anything else in the kitchen that's generating heat, you can set your bowl near the stove, you could set it near a radiator, or you can just leave it in the kitchen even if it's not especially warm. It'll just take a little bit longer to rise. So I'm going to stick this in my proofing oven, and I will be back when it's ready to do the next step. All right, we're back. My bread did not rise as much as I had hoped it would. I hope yours rose better than mine did, but we're going to go with it and hope for the best. So I'm going to start, as I said, we'll have to add a lot of flour to this to get it to the consistency we want. So I'm going to start by just putting a bunch of flour out on my counter. This is the part that gets very messy. I'm going to scrape the dough out of the bowl and just dump it in a heap on the flour. So don't be afraid to put flour on it, and we're just going to kind of fold it over itself and knead it, mix it around with that flour so that it gets less sticky. One of my favorite bread tools is this bench scraper. If you don't have one, it's fine, you don't have to have it, but it's really helpful in getting the sticky dough up off the counter. Okay, so you want to keep kneading your dough until it is not sticky anymore. Like this, I can work with it. It doesn't stick to my counter. It doesn't stick to my hands. and so that it kind of holds its shape when you shape it into a ball. What we don't want is it to be so soft that when we make it into a ball, it just kind of runs out and gets flat. So I'm going to divide this into 2 parts. You remember, we're making 2 loaves of bread. If you're just making 1 loaf of bread, you can keep it all together. But I'm making 2, so I'm going to divide it into 2 parts. And then there's a few things we can do from here. If you want to make this into a sandwich loaf, you can get a bread pan. I like these smaller ones. Mine are 8 inches by 4 inches, but you can use one that's a little bit bigger if that's what you have. And you want to make sure you spray it so that the bread doesn't stick to it. And then to shape the loaf, I recommend kind of folding the dough down underneath itself to make the top smooth, and just keep doing that. Fold it down and turn it, and fold it down and turn it, and as you do that, eventually the top will get pretty smooth. I'm gonna add a little more flour here because it's kind of sticky on the top. And once it starts to look smooth on the top, then you can work on getting it into an oval shape, sort of like a football or a log. So once you've gotten it into a log shape, then you just put it in your pan. If you're feeling really artistic and creative, you can get fancy and you can actually use your bench scraper or just a knife and cut it so that it's still together at one end but has 3 pieces, and then you can braid those over top of each other. Just kind of form that into a loaf, and so you can put that in your pan. You can also bypass the pan altogether and just make an artisan style loaf. So for instance, if you're making this to be your communion bread, you might want to try it in an artisan loaf, like a round loaf or an oval shaped loaf. For the purposes of today, I'm actually going to divide this into 2 parts, and I'm going to take my 1 loaf and make it into 2 tiny loaves. One of them I'm going to keep braided like this, but I'm going to make it round, and I'm just going to put it out on a sheet pan so that we can bake it just like that, like an artisan style loaf. The other one, I'm going to go back and make this one smooth on the top so that I can show you how to score it before it goes in the oven. So I'm going to be making 2 real tiny artisan loaves, which work well for our family to use as communion bread at home because we only need communion bread for 5 people. So there are my 2 artisan style loaves, and I'm going to set those aside, put a towel over them, and let them rise. Now I mentioned at the beginning that one of the options is to put a filling in the bread to make it like kind of a sweet bread that you would serve for breakfast or dessert or something like that. So I'm going to do that with this one. I'm going to add a little more flour to the counter so that I can roll it out without it sticking. And I'm going to roll it out into a rectangle with my rolling pin. You want the width of the rectangle to be in the neighborhood of the length of your pan if you're planning to put it in a loaf pan. And then maybe twice as long as it is wide. So I've just got it rolled out like that. And then you can spread whatever your filling is on top of it. If you've had some House of Bread, you'll know that when we make our cinnamon bread, we do a cinnamon swirl bread, and we put butter and cinnamon and brown sugar. And we also do a Nutella bread where we spread Nutella on top of it. Those are both really good. But really, you can fill it with anything that you can spread on it, any kind of jam, or I've done apple butter before. Today I'm going to be using an almond paste. I happen to have some ground almonds left over from another project. I've never tried this before, but I think it'll be good. It's just a mixture of butter with some ground almonds and confectioner's sugar. There's not really very much sugar in the dough, so you want your filling to be sweet if you're looking for a sweet bread. And we're just going to spread the filling out to cover the whole loaf. get it spread all the way to the edges. And then starting from one end, you want to just roll it up. And from here, you can either put it in your loaf pan, or you could slice it and set it out on like cinnamon rolls and bake those. So I'm just going to put this one in the loaf pan. And so that is also ready to rise. So I'm going to set my 2 tiny artisan style loaves and the loaf pan off to the side. I'm going to cover them with a towel and leave them in a warm place. And it'll probably take a pretty long time for them to rise, just like I did the first time. It'll probably take 45 minutes or an hour for them to just kind of puff up and be ready to bake. All right, we're back again, and our loaves are risen. The bread rose a lot better the second time than it did the first time, so I hope yours is working out well too. So you can see the ones in the loaf pan are risen an inch or so above the top of the pan. That should be good. And my artisan loaves have also risen. The one with the braid got kind of strange looking, but that's all right. And so on the one that's flat on the top, it's helpful to cut a score in the top of it so that it has a way to grow so that it doesn't crack when it grows. So I like to just sprinkle a little bit of flour on it, and then you can use a serrated knife and cut whatever pattern. You can cut, you know, a few 2 or 3 slashes in it, or crossed lines, or whatever you want. So I'm going to use it. I'm just going to cut a cross pattern in it like that. And then as soon as our oven is preheated, we can go ahead and stick the bread in, and it should bake for probably 25 to 35 minutes depending on which sizes of loaves you want. I'll probably pull the artisan loaves out a little bit earlier than the loaf pan just because they'll bake quicker. So I'll stick these in the oven and I'll show them to you when they're done. So here we are, bread's out of the oven. It's a little too hot for me to touch, but we've got our nice communion loaf and our sweet almond swirl bread. So whatever you decided to do with your bread, I hope it turned out well. I would love to hear how it turned out, and I'm always available for troubleshooting. So I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks. See you around.